Otaru was a small town by the sea in Hokkaido, Japan. It was a place of beauty and peace, where life moved slowly, and people enjoyed simple pleasures. The town was famous for its old buildings, narrow stone streets, and the beautiful canal that ran through its center. In the early mornings, the canal's water was so still that it reflected the sky like a mirror. Ducks and small boats floated quietly, making gentle ripples on the surface. The people of Otaru were proud of their town. Many families had lived there for generations, running small businesses that gave the town its special charm. There were glass workshops where skilled artisans made delicate glassware, their hands moving carefully as they shaped colorful cups and ornaments. Along the canal, little cafes served warm coffee and soft cakes, while seafood markets displayed the freshest fish caught from the sea that morning. The air was often filled with the scent of grilled squid and the sweetness of freshly baked bread from the old bakery near the station. Every season in Otaru had its own magic. In spring, cherry blossoms lined the streets, their pink petals falling gently like snow. Children played under the trees, trying to catch the petals in their hands. Summer brought a cool sea breeze that made the hot days comfortable, and people enjoyed walking along the beach, collecting pretty shells. In autumn, the hills around Otaru turned golden and red, as if the trees were wearing beautiful kimonos. The local markets were full of fresh apples, pumpkins, and handmade jams. But it was winter that made Otaru truly special. Heavy snow covered the rooftops, the streets, and the trees, turning the town into a fairy tale world. The canal became even more magical, with small lanterns placed along its edge. At night, their warm glow reflected on the icy water, creating a scene so beautiful that it looked like a painting. Families and friends gathered at home, sitting around warm stoves, drinking hot tea, and telling stories. For years, Otaru remained this way, quiet, peaceful, and full of simple joys. The locals loved their town, and visitors who came were few but always respectful. But as time passed, more and more people began to discover Otaru's charm. Things were about to change. At first, the people of Otaru were happy to see more visitors. They welcomed travelers who came to admire the beautiful canal, taste fresh seafood, and buy handmade glass souvenirs. Some shop owners noticed that their businesses were growing. More people meant more customers, and for a while it felt like a good change. However, as time passed, the number of tourists increased quickly. Otaru became famous on social media, with thousands of photos and videos showing its winter scenery. People from all over Japan, and even from other countries, wanted to visit. Travel bloggers wrote about the town's hidden beauty, and influencers posted videos of themselves walking along the snowy canal, eating soft ice cream and taking pictures in front of the old warehouses. The quiet little town was no longer a secret. In winter, the situation became even more intense. Hokkaido was a dream destination for skiers, and many of them used Otaru as a stop before heading to the famous ski resorts nearby. Trains coming from Sapporo were packed with tourists carrying large ski equipment. Local residents, who once enjoyed peaceful train rides, now found it difficult to even get a seat. Elderly people who used to take the train to visit friends or go shopping often had to wait for the next one because there was no space left. The streets also became crowded. The narrow stone paths, once quiet and calm, were now filled with people taking photos, walking in groups, and searching for the best local food. Long lines formed outside popular restaurants, making it hard for locals to enjoy their favorite meals. Some tourists even entered private gardens thinking they were part of the sightseeing spots and took photos without permission. Public buses struggled to keep up with the demand. Every morning, tourists lined up at the bus stops, hoping to get a good spot to explore the town. Residents who just needed to go to work or school often found themselves stuck in the crowd. Some bus drivers looked tired, trying their best to manage the situation, but there were simply too many people. At first, the locals were patient. They understood that tourism brought money and opportunities. But as the months went by, frustration began to grow. The town they loved was changing, and they weren't sure if it was for the better. Otaru was no longer the quiet little town it once was. It had become a tourist hotspot, and not everyone was happy about it. As more and more tourists arrived, life in Otaru became difficult for the local people. The peaceful town was now full of noise, crowds, and endless lines. The charm of the small, quiet streets was disappearing, replaced by the sound of rolling suitcases, loud voices, and camera shutters clicking non-stop. One of the biggest problems was public transportation. Every morning, the local train station was packed with visitors. Tourists, excited to explore the town, rushed onto the trains, leaving little space for residents. Elderly people and students who had used the trains for years often found themselves standing for long journeys or unable to board at all. Some sighed in frustration, while others simply gave up and waited for the next train, hoping it would be less crowded. But it never was. Buses were no better. Every day, long lines formed at bus stops. When a bus finally arrived, it was already full. Many residents, who just needed to go to work, school, or the market, felt trapped in their own town. One local woman, Mrs. Tanaka, sighed as she watched yet another full bus drive past. "This used to be our home," she said to a neighbor. "Now it feels like a theme park." But transportation was not the only problem. Many visitors did not understand or simply ignored local customs. Some tourists entered private gardens without permission, stepping on delicate plants just to take the perfect photo. Others left trash on the streets or ate food while walking, something that was considered impolite in Japanese culture. One afternoon, Mr. Sato, an elderly shop owner, noticed a group of tourists standing in front of his home. They were taking pictures and laughing, as if his house were a museum. "Excuse me," he said politely. "This is my home." But the tourists did not understand Japanese, and they simply smiled and continued taking pictures. Frustrated, Mr. Sato went inside and closed the door. Restaurants and cafes also struggled. Some small family-owned restaurants, which had served locals for generations, now had lines of tourists stretching outside. The wait times were so long that many local people simply stopped going. The cozy neighborhood cafes, once a place for quiet conversation, were now filled with the sounds of tourists speaking different languages, taking photos of their food and checking their phones. Even nature was suffering. Otaru's famous canal, once a peaceful and romantic spot, became overcrowded with visitors. People leaned over the stone walls, dropping food crumbs into the water. Some even climbed onto the old bridges to take selfies, ignoring safety signs. The town's beautiful winter landscape, once untouched and pure, was now covered with footprints and scattered trash. The residents of Otaru had always been friendly and welcoming. They understood that tourism was important for the economy. But as their town changed, frustration grew. It was no longer just a small problem. It was a crisis. Something had to be done. The people of Otaru loved their town, and they knew something had to change. The streets were too crowded, public transportation was overwhelmed, and some visitors did not respect local customs. The situation could not continue like this. The city government held a meeting to discuss possible solutions. Business owners, local residents, and tourism experts gathered to share their thoughts. Some shop owners believed that tourism was still important for the local economy. "We don't want to stop visitors from coming," said Mr. Yamamoto, who owned a souvenir shop near the canal. "We just need better management." Others, like Mrs. Tanaka, who had lived in Otaru for over 50 years, were more frustrated. "We can't even get on the train anymore," she said. "This is our home, not just a tourist attraction." After much discussion, the city government announced a series of new measures. First, they decided to increase public transportation services. More buses and trains would run during peak tourist seasons, making it easier for both locals and visitors to travel. Special tourist buses were introduced to take visitors directly to popular attractions, reducing pressure on the regular bus lines. Signs in multiple languages were placed at stations to help tourists find the right transportation, so they wouldn't overcrowd local routes. Second, the government added more security and staff at the busiest tourist spots. Along the famous canal, guards and city volunteers now walked around, reminding visitors not to climb onto bridges, litter, or disturb private properties. Signs in English, Chinese, and Korean were placed near popular locations, politely asking tourists to follow local customs. "Please respect the town and its people," one sign near a residential area read. To help protect local businesses, some restaurants introduced a reservation system. This allowed both locals and tourists to book tables in advance, ensuring that residents could still enjoy their favorite meals without having to wait for hours. Some cafes even created local-only hours during certain times of the day, giving residents a space to relax without the rush of tourists. Another major change was the introduction of a visitor tax. Tourists staying overnight in Otaru now had to pay a small fee, which the government used to clean the streets, improve transportation, and maintain historical sites. Other tourist-heavy places in Japan, like Kyoto, had already done this, and Otaru hoped it would help manage the rising number of visitors. Social media influencers were also asked to be more responsible. The government worked with travel bloggers to encourage respectful tourism. Instead of promoting hidden or secret spots that were actually private homes, influencers were invited to share the history and culture of Otaru in a way that benefited both tourists and locals. Slowly, things started to improve. Trains and buses became less crowded, and residents could travel more easily. The streets were still busy, but tourists were becoming more mindful of local rules. With better management, Otaru began to find a balance between being a peaceful home and a beautiful travel destination. But was it enough? Only time would tell. As time passed, the changes in Otaru began to take effect. The streets were still lively with visitors, but the chaos had lessened. Public transportation ran more smoothly, allowing both residents and tourists to travel comfortably. Local businesses continued to benefit from tourism, but now, with better management, they could also serve the people who had lived in Otaru for generations. One of the most noticeable changes was in the behavior of the tourists. Thanks to clear signs, security staff, and social media awareness campaigns, visitors became more respectful of local customs. People no longer entered private gardens without permission, and many learned to lower their voices when walking through quiet neighborhoods. Tourists also started using designated photo zones instead of blocking narrow streets to take pictures. Mr. Sato, the elderly shop owner, was surprised one day when a young tourist asked him for permission before taking a photo of his traditional wooden house. "Thank you for asking," he said with a smile. "Go ahead." Moments like these made the residents feel that their town was finally being respected again. The reservation system for restaurants helped both locals and tourists enjoy Otaru's famous seafood and sweets without long waiting times. The visitor tax contributed to keeping the streets clean, maintaining historic sites, and organizing cultural events. The town even introduced special local experience programs where visitors could learn about Otaru's traditions, such as glassblowing or making fresh seafood dishes, rather than just rushing to take pictures and leave. The town's famous winter festival also saw positive changes. In previous years, the festival had become overcrowded, making it difficult for people to enjoy the beautiful lanterns along the canal. Now, with controlled entry and better crowd management, the festival regained its magical atmosphere. Families, both local and visiting, walked peacefully through the snowy streets, admiring the soft glow of the lanterns reflecting on the water. Even social media influencers played a role in promoting responsible tourism. Instead of focusing only on Instagram-worthy pictures, they began sharing the history, culture, and stories of Otaru. Visitors started coming not just for photos, but to truly experience the town's beauty and traditions. The residents of Otaru also adapted to the changes. While some were hesitant at first, they began to see the benefits of a well-managed tourism industry. More jobs were created, and young people who had once left for bigger cities started returning to work in tourism-related businesses. The town remained a popular destination, but now it felt like a place where both visitors and locals could coexist happily. One evening, Mrs. Tanaka sat outside her home, sipping a warm cup of tea. She watched as a small group of tourists walked quietly by, admiring the snowy rooftops and the soft glow of the streetlights. Nearby, a local family was chatting outside a cafe, enjoying a peaceful winter night. For the first time in years, Otaru felt like home again. It was still a beloved tourist destination, but it had regained its heart. a place where the past and present, the visitors and the residents could exist in harmony. And so, Otaru became not just a travel hotspot, but an example of how tourism and community life could thrive together.